Hi and welcome to Elitmind Academy. My name is Pawel Potasinski and I'm going to present you the third episode of Modern Data Warehouse in Azure series. Today I'm going to cover the data lake structure and how you should work with its zones, how you should plan the data lake to make sure that you're not going to turn it into the data swamp. So with that, let me show you how you should work with data lake. Okay, so let's move to the data lake part of the modern data warehouse in Azure architecture. So in the previous episodes, I provided you this reference architecture, and we discussed several things around the options of for data lake and for data warehouse parts of this architecture. Today we're going to focus again on the storage and the data lake part of this architecture. And just to make sure that you understand why this part is important and how to work with this storage in order to maximize gains for your analytics. Now, the very important thing before you start working with data lake is to carefully plan the zones for the data lake. What are the zones? The zones are actually the parts or folders or places in the data lake that are specifically designed and planned for storing the data that are in some phase of transition between being raw data and the data that can be standardized and served to the analytics. So typically the raw data coming from the operational systems suffer from several things like lack of data quality, some mistypes, some mistakes in data. So basically, you will for sure want to run some transformations, some curations on top of your data. So the very first part of your data lake should be the place where you store raw data coming from your both on-prem and cloud systems. This will keep the data coming not just from your databases and files, but also from streamings and all different very rapidly changing data sources. And you can plan not just raw zone for your data lake. You can also have different zones that are very similar to raw data zone, but also providing some additional features. So, for example, you can put your data coming from websites and web services into transient zone, just to make sure that you're going to provide some additional metadata before this data lands in the raw zone. You can also provide a drop zone for your users and for your automatic RPA processes that will copy the data from your organization into the data lake, and then you will consume this data easily. You can also create a place where master data will land. Master data understood as the data that is well known and is centrally managed by data stewards, and this is typically required in order to perform some meaningful analytics. The second part of the data lake should be those zones that are designed to store some transformed data. So, for example, you will run several transformations to cure your data from typical mistakes and data quality issues, and then you can position it in the curated data zone. The curated data can be used, for example, by the analysts in order to build some pre-work just before it lands in the standardized data, and just before you put this data in your data warehouse. So you really want to keep your data warehouse only containing this data that is standardized and clear and free from the data quality issues, and definitely fitting the data warehouse schema, which is typically around describing well-known entities in the company, like product or customer. Now, the analytics sandbox is a pretty much interesting part of data lake. Typically, this is the zone used by the analysts to make sure that they can work on different zones and write back the results of their analytics in the data lake, so the results can be easily consumed either by the analysts or by the external users that the analysts are going to provide access to this sandbox. Now, also you can use the staged data zone to make sure that anything coming from the raw zone and being transformed is passed in some process to the data warehouse part of this architecture. Now, over time, your data warehouse can grow in the volume of data, so you may consider creating archive data zone in the data lake to store some historical data from your data warehouse. Well, typically, data warehouse should be planned to store the whole history of your data, of your well-known data in the company, but there are some situations when you want to just get rid of some portion of data that you are not going to store anymore in the data warehouse. So we can just easily move this part of data to archive data zone. And also, about security, you will have to deal with sensitive data. So any data being under regulations like GDPR can land here. So you can just divide your data sets and between the sensitive data and other zones that will store all the rest of the data not being sensitive, right? So the hierarchy of the data lake, if you plan it, if you start to plan it, may be different from this example, but you have to follow some pattern. Typically, people want to divide data among different business areas, among different data sources, to make sure that you know that the data is coming from ERP, CRM, or whatever system you have in your organization. Typically, the best approach is to split the data among time parts. So you will probably want to keep your data coming in the same year separately, and at the same time you would also want to partition your data by month, by day, and in some cases even on the lower level of granularity, like hour. So keep in mind that the naming of your folders or the parts of the path for each file should be consistent, and it can be different in many situations. To give you an example, this notation here, year equals 2019, can be very helpful from the perspective of some big data systems or databases, because they can utilize this paths to run some pruning and just make sure that they read only the data that is necessary to read to bring some analytics. So this is called filtering, and it can help to avoid reading some unnecessary portion of data. Now, you're not limited to creating the data lake and the zones just as I shown you 2 slides ago, but keep in mind that there are some principles for data lake and its zones. So first of all, it requires careful planning. It's not like you're sitting down and just create your storage and then put every single piece of data in this data lake and you're done. Typically, when you do that and when you approach the data lake without careful planning, you will quickly end up in the situation where people don't know which data is ready for analytics, which data is raw and which data is curated, which parts of data can be imported into the data warehouse. So definitely you have to plan zones, you have to plan hierarchies, namings, how to split the data to maximize performance for big data systems, how to plan your file formats. You have different file formats, and you have to make sure that the file formats are acceptable by your platforms. To give you an example, JSON format is currently not very good file format for Azure Synapse Analytics. So definitely for this platform, you would like to play with CSV or Parquet and not JSON. And also keep in mind that data lake is not free from the security part of the analytics platform. So you have to plan data access patterns, which groups of users will have access to which zones and which hierarchies. Now, if you plan this, you have to keep it consistent. So just be aware that these decisions you make on the very early stage of building data lake will have to remain untouched, or if you touch it, the changes have to be documented and shared with the users, because otherwise you will end up again in the situation when nobody knows where the data needed for analytics resides. Now, it's all about the process. So not only creating data lake zones is important. It's also important to make sure that all the stakeholders and the data stewards are aware of the places in the data lake that are used for different phases of data analytics. So you should have a document describing the rules for moving data among different zones. You should have processes of loading the data from your original systems into the data warehouse part of the analytics platform. You should have write down your access policies to make sure that definitely you're not going to grant any access to sensitive data to unexpected users. And also you should consider data and zone ownership to make sure that there is somebody responsible for each portion of data being kept in the data lake. Now, metadata is something that you should never underestimate, because it will allow you to provide some information to any catalog platform that is going to be implemented on top of your data. So it doesn't really matter whether you're going to implement third-party software over data lake or you're going to use Microsoft services in Azure. Definitely metadata, so tags and things around describing the data will help you in the future whenever you're going to work with the data. And make sure that you're taking care about the optimizations that may occur on the data lake stage, on the data lake level of the architecture, because at some point it may be pretty much costful to change the layout of your data lake and for example, provide some performance to big data systems. If you follow these rules, you will probably avoid data swamp. Data swamp is the name of the data lake that was not carefully planned, or it just falls into one of the issues that rise just after people don't care about the structure of the data lake, or they work with the data lake in an inconsistent way. So just keep in mind that you really don't want this data swamp to be a part of your architecture, because yeah, that definitely makes analytics harder. Now let me just show you some example of how the data lake may look like, or at least its part. So I have this simple data lake containing only two data lake zones, row, where I have only the data from one data source being kept. So I have this folder structure coming from row through sales, which is my business area, to ERP, which is my source system, invoices, this is let's say a table, and then I have the data spread among years. So I have year 2010, and then I decided not to spread among months and days, because the data is pretty much small. So you may make this decision to avoid some unnecessary partitioning of data. Now, how can I work with this data? Of course, in a different way depending on the system. But to give you an idea on how these zones may cooperate, I will also use some additional Azure service, this time Azure Databricks, to work with the raw data and consume this data and write back this data into analytical sandbox. So I've already mounted this data lake to the Databricks. I'm not going to show this part of code, but instead of that, I will just build a temporary view called invoices that will import the data coming from the year 2011. So I will just run this on top of my Databricks cluster, and it should create a temporary view, so I could just run SQL queries on top of this data. Now, there is some structure underneath, so fortunately I didn't have to provide schema, and that's also a very important part of the data lake. You can use the approach data first, schema last, and not the schema first, data last, as you normally do using databases. So I just can consume the data that is stored within CSV files, even not knowing the exact schema of the files. So the schema is like this, and I can also show you some data from these files. This is not very complex data, but it just keeps information about invoices and the quantity and the unit price of the products, and additional information of which customer and in which country produced this invoice. Now let's create some summary of this data. And I will just do some grouping by country and month of invoice date, and I will count the invoices for each country in each month. And I will create a temporary view for that. And finally, I will use this Python script to produce from my invoice summary temporary view a single file which will contain this grouped information. So to give you an overview on what kind of data I will have in my summary file, let me just do a select star from invoices summary. So this will just give you an idea on what's going to happen underneath. So this is actually the data set: country, month, invoices. Pretty much easy. Now I'm going to run this, and in a second I should have a file. So I will move to my data lake, and I will try to show you that in my sandbox, in sales invoices year 2011, I have invoices summary, and the structure of this file is actually the same as the result of my query I ran just a second ago. So country, month, invoices, and then the rows of data. Now the analyst stepping into this data lake, knowing that there is a sandbox, or the same analyst that produced this file can get back to this sandbox residing in data lake, and he can take this single summary file and create another temporary view just to make sure that the analytics is based on already prepared data that is stored in the sandbox. And I can run some query, for example, filtering my invoices data to United Kingdom, sorting the data by month. So I will just see how the number of invoices changed over months for United Kingdom. And as an analyst, I would really want to provide this kind of analytics in the visual form, so I can move to my visualizations and eventually even use the BI tool to make some mockups on top of the data. So as you can see, you can very quickly move from the raw data to the data being prepared in the analytical sandbox and provide some meaningful analytics on top of your data lake. But this is definitely the easiest part of the data lake, while the toughest part of the data lake is avoiding data swamp. Just keep in mind, you have to stick to the principles in order to keep your data lake clean, secure, and usable for the analysts. The data lake can be pretty much useful part of your analytical platform, but make sure that you have your processes and planning in place, because you can easily turn the data lake into the data swamp or any kind of disaster mess that is possible whenever you deal with large number of files, high volume of data, and the high requirements from your business users. So just remember the principles that I mentioned today. Plan your zones carefully, plan your processes, and then data lake can bring you a lot of value for your analytics. Thank you for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed this series, and stay tuned for more.